Picture a single, gold-dusted thread. One end is tied to the polished heel of Louis XIV as he glides across the Hall of Mirrors. The other disappears into the suffocating hold of a Spanish brigantine, where chained bodies are bartered for the sugar that sweetens the Sun King's coffee. Think of the Bourbon crown not as a symbol of grace, but as a high-pressure pump. On one side, it sucked the marrow from the French peasantry through the crushing weight of the gabelle and tile taxes. On the other, it siphoned the silver veins of the Andes and the human capital of Africa into a private family vault. This wasn't just wealth, it was an engineered monopoly. Today, we go beyond the polished oil paintings to unlock a vault of secrets the history books often gloss over. We will expose how the Bourbons turned the law into a vacuum cleaner, from the asiento licenses that converted human souls into royal profit, to the golden cage of Versailles, where the nobility was systematically bankrupted to ensure only the king held the purse strings. You will witness how the rumors of a smoking cassock swirled around the brutal assassination of Henry IV, and the chilling state technology of the man in the iron mask, where the monarchy proved it could legally erase a human identity to safeguard a royal secret. We'll peel back the coded ciphers of Marie Antoinette's forbidden romance and follow the desperate, midnight dust of the flight to Varennes, where the king's divine aura failed him against the ubiquitous image on the state's currency. Most disturbingly, we'll expose the enlightened King Charles III, whose grand fountains in Madrid became the unintended monuments to the staggering profits of an escalated slave trade. From the blood-stained cobbles of Paris to the silver-rich veins of Potosí, this is the untold saga of how the Bourbons orchestrated the greatest wealth transfer in history, saw fusing unimaginable wealth with profound scandal to survive the guillotine and remain on a throne to this very day. To understand the sheer scale of this dynastic heist, we have to look at the man who first traded his faith for a capital city and a dowry that would fund a revolution in style. The history of the Bourbon Dynasty is often portrayed as a seamless progression of divine right, but in 1589, it was a venture on the verge of bankruptcy. Henry of Navarre, the first Bourbon to claim the French throne, did not inherit a kingdom so much as a smoking ruin. France was shattered by the wars of religion, a 40-year cycle of bloodletting between Catholics and Huguenots that had effectively decapitated the national economy. When Henry IV ascended, he was a king without a capital, barred from Paris by the Catholic League, and viewed with suspicion by the very Protestant allies who had bled for him. To survive, Henry realized he needed to perform a miracle of political alchemy. He had to turn a religious conflict into a corporate merger. The first stroke of this strategy was his legendary conversion to Catholicism in 1593. While popular history focuses on the wit of his phrase, "Paris is well worth a mass," and the reality was a cold-blooded financial calculation. By buying his way into Paris with a religious compromise, Henry was not just seeking a crown, he was seeking access to the tax-collecting machinery of the state. However, the machine was broken. The royal treasury was a hollow shell, burdened by debts to Swiss mercenaries, German landsknechts, and the English crown. To stabilize his newly secured but financially ruined dynasty, a legitimate and ancient branch of the royal Capetian bloodline, Henry needed an immediate and massive infusion of liquidity, an amount no French banker could provide. This led to the first great leveraged buyout in Bourbon history, the marriage of Henry IV to Marie de' Medici in 1600. Marie was the daughter of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the head of the Medici banking empire. In the corridors of the Pitti Palace in Florence, this was viewed not as a romance, but as a strategic asset acquisition. Marie brought with her a staggering dowry of 600,000 gold crowns, the largest single payment in the history of the French monarchy. Documents preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Firenze reveal the sheer scale of this transaction. This was new money from the Italian banking sector flowing into the old blood of the French aristocracy. The Medici dowry didn't just pay for the wedding festivities. It functioned as venture capital for the Bourbon state. It allowed Henry to pay off the most pressing of his foreign creditors, effectively refinancing the French debt at a lower political interest rate. By marrying into the Medici family, Henry IV had essentially sold a stake in the French crown to the most sophisticated financial minds of the Renaissance. With this capital secured, Henry turned his attention to the internal plumbing of the state. Alongside his brilliant superintendent of finances, the Duke of Sully, he began to turn the law into a vacuum cleaner for wealth. Sully, a man who viewed the kingdom through the lens of a ledger, understood that a king's power was only as strong as his ability to extract surplus from the land. Together they introduced the paulette in 1604. The paulette was a revolutionary, if cynical, tax. For a fee, an annual payment of 1/60th of the value of their office, government officials could make their positions hereditary. It was a stroke of genius in financial engineering. It provided the king with an immediate, recurring stream of income and created a new class of bureaucrats, the nobility of the robe, whose wealth and status were tied directly to the survival of the Bourbon line. These were the shareholders of the state, and their dividends depended on the king's stability. While the old nobility of the sword looked on with aristocratic disdain, the Bourbons were building a loyal, administrative army that operated on the logic of profit and loss. To ensure the high-pressure pump operated without leakage, Henry IV's superintendent of finances, the Duke of Sully, implemented a revolutionary system of bureaucratic surveillance. He didn't just collect taxes, he performed predatory audits. Sully traveled the provinces in a heavily guarded carriage, conducting surprise inspections of the local tax farmers and governors. He demanded to see the physical ledgers of the gabelle, salt tax, cross-referencing the weight of salt sold with the coins in the local vaults. Those found with missing capital weren't just fined, they were systematically replaced by royal intendants, loyal technocrats who answered only to the crown. This was the moment the Bourbon startup moved from feudal chaos to data-driven centralization. The law was no longer a tradition. It was a set of accounting protocols designed to ensure that every drop of French sweat resulted in a golden coin for the king. Henry and Sully didn't stop at taxation. They pioneered a primitive form of state capitalism. They drained the marshes of the Saintonge to increase arable land, turning stagnant water into productive tax-paying soil. They planted millions of mulberry trees across France, a strategic move to break the Italian monopoly on the silk trade. Every tree planted was a calculated attempt to keep gold from flowing out of the country, the very essence of mercantilism. They were engineering an economy that could support a permanent standing army, a luxury no previous French king had truly mastered. However, this rapid centralization of wealth and power created a high-pressure environment. The Protestant Huguenots felt betrayed by Henry's conversion, while radical Catholics viewed his tolerant Edict of Nantes, which gave Protestants civil rights, as an invitation to divine wrath. The Medici gold had bought Henry time and a functioning state, but it had also made him the ultimate target. In the eyes of religious hardliners, Henry was no longer a king. He was a CIO who had compromised the brand of the faith for the sake of the ledger of the state. As the first decade of the 1600s drew to a close, France was once again flourishing. The pump was working, the treasury was full, the silk mills were humming, and the king was preparing to challenge the Habsburgs for European dominance. But in the shadows of the narrow Parisian streets, a different kind of auditor was waiting. One who didn't want a seat at the board, but a dagger in the heart of the man who had traded his soul for a capital city. The startup phase of the Bourbon Dynasty was about to end in blood, proving that while money could buy a kingdom, it could never buy complete security. By 1605, the Bourbon-engineered monopoly was beginning to take shape with terrifying efficiency. Henry IV was no longer merely a survivor of a brutal civil war. He had transformed into the most formidable power broker in Europe. While his rivals, the Spanish Habsburgs, were beginning to suffocate under the weight of New World silver, which, ironically, was triggering hyperinflation and rotting their domestic industry, Henry practiced a leaner, more agile brand of mercantilism. To ensure that no grain of sand or leaf of tobacco went unaccounted for, Henry and his superintendent of finances, the Duke of Sully, established a system of financial surveillance that would make a modern auditor shudder. Sully's memoirs, the Economies Royales, serve as much more than a historical record. They are a cold-blooded blueprint for dynastic dominance. Sully did not just track the flow of taxes, he meticulously tracked the vulnerabilities of the elite. Through a vast network of provincial intendants, he knew exactly which noble was overleveraged and which governor was skimming from the gabelle, salt tax. This data was weaponized. If a noble family became too defiant, Henry didn't always need to mobilize an army. He simply sent a debt collector or threatened an audit of their ancestral estates. By centralizing the financial records of the realm, the Bourbons began to treat the French state not as a public trust, but as a private family vault. The wealth siphoned from the French peasantry was immediately reinvested into a massive clandestine intelligence infrastructure. Henry's Black Chamber, Cabinet Noir, was the most sophisticated spy ring of its time. They intercepted the secret dispatches of Spanish diplomats and Vatican legates, decoding them with an efficiency that left the Pope's advisors in a state of constant paranoia. Henry's geopolitical objective was surgically precise: break the Habsburg encirclement of France. To achieve this, he used the royal treasury to bankroll Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and funded clandestine sabotage within the Holy Roman Empire. This was the era of the Grand Design, Henry's vision of a pan-European confederation intended to balance power and end religious strife. However, modern historians, scrutinizing the secret correspondence between Paris and London, I detect a far more cynical motive. Henry didn't want to end monopolies. He wanted to replace the Habsburg monopoly with a Bourbon one. He was strategically positioning France to seize the lucrative spice routes and the budding colonial outposts in the Americas. He understood that in the New World Order, the sword was merely the servant of the ledger. However, funding a preemptive strike against the combined might of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire required more than just the Medici dowry. It required total national mobilization. By the spring of 1610, Henry had amassed a formidable army of 30,000 men and a war chest capable of sustaining years of conflict. He was on the verge of launching a campaign that would have redrawn the map of Europe 2 centuries before Napoleon. But the radical factions within France were watching with growing fury. To the Catholic hardliners, Henry was not a visionary statesman. He was a heretic king preparing to lead a Catholic nation into a war that would benefit Protestant heretics abroad. The atmosphere in Paris became a physical weight, a suffocating, humid tension that even the grandest fountains in the Louvre could not cool. The Bourbon high-pressure pump was working at its maximum capacity, siphoning resources for a war that many felt was a betrayal of God. The pipes of the dynasty were vibrating with the strain, and in the shadows of the narrow Parisian streets, a different kind of auditor was preparing to strike a final, bloody balance. The 14th of May, 1610, remains the most scrutinized and haunting date in the early Bourbon ledger. As Henry IV's carriage inched through the perpetually bottlenecked Rue de la Ferronnerie, the engineered monopoly of the first Bourbon king was shattered by a long kitchen knife. François Ravaillac, a failed schoolteacher and Catholic zealot, lunged twice into the king's chest, ending the life of the man who had brought a fragile peace to France. Officially, Ravaillac was a lone wolf, and a madman who heard the voice of God. But the smoking cassock theory, the belief that he was merely the razor-sharp point of a Jesuit spear, has lingered like a ghost in the Parisian archives for 4 centuries. To understand the logic of the assassination, one must look at the timing. Henry was killed just weeks before he was set to launch a massive military campaign against the Habsburgs. His spy master, the Duke of Sully, had spent years accumulating a war chest of unprecedented scale. The Habsburgs, the Pope, and the militant Catholic factions within France all viewed this upcoming war as an existential threat to the Catholic order. When Ravaillac struck, he didn't just kill a man, he decapitated a geopolitical strategy. The interrogation of Ravaillac was a masterpiece of state-sponsored theater. While his body was broken on the rack and eventually torn apart by horses in the Place de Grève, the official investigation seemed suspiciously designed to avoid finding a wider conspiracy. Why were the king's guards so conveniently scattered at the moment of the strike? Why did Marie de Medici have herself crowned queen only 24 hours before the assassination, a ceremony she had delayed for an entire decade? These questions were not just ignored, they were buried under the heavy drapes of royal privilege. Modern historians, such as Patrice Guénefé, point to a chilling detail: the guilt by hallway association. Ravaillac had once lodged in a Jesuit household, and the Jesuit order had been expelled years earlier for suspected regicide. Yet, in the aftermath of 1610, there was no crackdown. Instead, Marie de' Medici performed a breathtaking political pivot. She suppressed the rumors of a conspiracy, not because they were false, but because they were too dangerous. To hunt the Jesuits or implicate the Spanish would have meant reopening the wounds of the Civil War, a cost the fledgling Bourbon Dynasty could not afford to pay. The regency of Marie de' Medici was a masterclass in the high cost of transparency. She understood that the engineered monopoly required a stable face, even if the foundation was soaked in blood. She used the remainder of her Medici fortune to buy the loyalty of the great nobles who were ready to revolt. Where she reversed Henry's anti-Habsburg foreign policy, literally marrying her son, the future Louis XIII, into the Spanish royal family that many believed had ordered his father's death. It was a cold, calculated trade. The truth of a father's murder was swapped for the survival of the son's throne. By meticulously covering up loose threads and suppressing inconvenient depositions, and the Bourbons learned their second great lesson: royal stability and the preservation of the crown matter infinitely more than public transparency or courtroom truth. They created a cult of Henry the Great, turning a pragmatic, often hated king into a national martyr to paper over the cracks in their legitimacy. This culture of secrecy, born in the blood-stained cobbles of the Rue de la Ferronnerie, would become the DNA of the dynasty. It would later evolve into the cabinet noir of Louis XIV and the encrypted ciphers of Marie Antoinette. The startup was over. The Bourbons had survived their first great crisis by proving they could be more ruthless in peace than they were in war. They had successfully transitioned from a line of warrior kings to a dynasty of strategic survivors, ready to build a golden cage that would eventually trap the world. The transition from the foundational struggles of Henry IV to the blinding radiance of the Sun King, Louis XIV, represents the ultimate perfection of the Bourbon high-pressure pump. If Henry IV built the pump with Medici gold and provincial grit, Louis XIV turned it into a masterwork of psychological, architectural, and financial engineering. Central to this era was the construction and operation of Versailles, not merely a palace of mirrors and gold, but a golden cage designed to systematically bankrupt the French nobility and ensure that the king alone held the purse strings of the nation. To understand the logic of Versailles, one must look at it through the lens of an engineered monopoly. Louis XIV understood that the greatest threat to Bourbon absolute power was not a foreign army, but the independent wealth and military potential of the French aristocracy. These were the men who had fueled the Fronde, in a series of civil wars that had traumatized the king's childhood. To neutralize this threat, Louis orchestrated the greatest wealth transfer in domestic French history. He did not seize their lands by decree. Instead, he made those lands irrelevant. Louis XIV mandated that the high nobility reside at Versailles for the majority of the year. By doing so, he uprooted them from their local power bases in the provinces. Once settled in the palace, the nobility found themselves trapped in a ruinous economy of display. At the Hall of Mirrors, under the gold-dusted ceiling, status was no longer measured by the size of one's ancestral army, but by the proximity to the king's person. This proximity had a price. To maintain their standing, nobles were forced to invest astronomical sums in an escalating arms race of fashion, gambling, and ritualized luxury. A single court suit could cost more than a provincial manor. A night at the Queen's gambling tables could wipe out a decade's worth of agricultural rents. This was the law turned into a vacuum cleaner. As the nobles' ancestral wealth drained away in the pursuit of royal favor, they became increasingly reliant on royal pensions and appointments to survive. The king effectively became the sole venture capitalist of the realm. By centralizing the elite within the walls of Versailles, Louis XIV ensured that the human capital of France was domesticated. Their ambitions were redirected from regional rebellion to the ceremonial act of handing the king his shirt in the morning or holding his candle at night. Every gesture was a transaction, every ritual was a shackle. However, the staggering cost of Versailles, estimated to have consumed up to 25% of the national revenue at its peak, required a relentless extraction of wealth from the broader population. This is where the Bourbon high-pressure pump reached its most brutal efficiency. While the heels of Louis XIV glided across polished mirrors, the funds were siphoned from the French peasantry through the crushing weight of the gabelle, the salt tax, and the taille, the land tax. The gabelle was particularly insidious, a state-mandated monopoly that forced every citizen over the age of 7 to purchase a fixed amount of salt each week at an inflated price set by the crown. It was a tax on survival itself. Meanwhile, the taille fell almost exclusively on the peasantry, as the nobility and clergy were largely exempt. This created a profound economic distortion. The very people who produced the nation's food were being bled dry to fund the golden cage that housed those who produced nothing. Louis XIV also refined the nobility of the robe system initiated by his grandfather. He expanded the sale of royal offices to an unprecedented scale, and turning the bureaucracy into a massive source of immediate liquidity. Wealthy bourgeois families scrambled to buy these titles, providing the king with the cash needed to fund his endless wars of expansion, while the crown provided them with social prestige and tax exemptions. It was a cycle of short-term gain that bloated the state apparatus and laid the seeds of future resentment. But for Louis, it was the perfect mechanism to keep the treasury flowing. In this engineered monopoly, Versailles functioned as the ultimate PR machine. Every fountain, every gilded statue, and every choreographed firework display was designed to project an image of infinite, effortless wealth. It was a theater of power intended to intimidate foreign ambassadors and convince the French people that the king's resources were as inexhaustible as the sun itself. Yet, beneath the polished oil paintings and the sprawling gardens lay a vault built on the siphoned veins of a nation. The splendor was the mask. The extraction was the reality. As we move deeper into the Sun King's reign, we will see that this monopoly on wealth and image was not just about luxury. It was about the absolute erasure of any alternative to the Bourbon throne. While Versailles served as the golden cage for the visible elite, the Bourbon monarchy developed a far more chilling mechanism for those who threatened the internal sanctity of the engineered monopoly. If the palace was the theater of power, then the state prisons were its silent, dark basement. At the heart of this shadow system was the chilling technology of state secrecy, exemplified by the most enigmatic prisoner in history, the man in the iron mask. This was not merely a tale of cruelty, but a sophisticated tool of statecraft, used to safeguard the Bourbon crown from any perceived stain or challenge to its legitimacy. Louis XIV understood that in an absolute monarchy, the king's image was his greatest asset. Anything that suggested a flaw in the bloodline, a secret marriage, a hidden twin, or a catastrophic indiscretion was a potential leak in the high-pressure pump. To prevent such leaks, the Bourbons turned the lettre de cachet into a weapon of total erasure. These were royal warrants, signed by the king and countersigned by a minister, that allowed for the indefinite imprisonment of any individual without trial, without a formal charge, and most critically, without a name. In the eyes of the law, a person held under a lettre de cachet ceased to exist as a legal entity. The man in the iron mask was the ultimate product of this system, a human being whose very face, the primary marker of human identity, was declared a state secret. The logistics of this prisoner's incarceration, as detailed in the surviving reports of Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, the governor of the Bastille, reveal the extreme, almost obsessive lengths to which the Bourbons would go to maintain an informational monopoly. The prisoner was not merely moved. He was transported in a covered, reinforced litter, hidden from the eyes of the public and even the soldiers who guarded the route. During his transit between the fortress prisons of Pignerol, the Exils, the windswept Sainte Marguerite Islands, and finally, the Bastille, the orders were absolute. If the prisoner attempted to communicate with anyone or revealed his face, he was to be executed on the spot. He was provided with high-quality meals and fine linens, a sign of his high social status, yet he was denied the most basic human right, to be known. This technology of silence served a dual purpose in the Bourbons' engineered monopoly. First, it functioned as a terrifying psychological deterrent. The existence of a prisoner who could be erased so completely created an aura of godlike power around Louis XIV. It signaled to the nobility and the commoners alike that the king could not only take your life, but could remove your very existence from the fabric of history. To vanish into the king's prisons was to be unlived. Second, it protected the dynasty from the risk of political contagion. Whether the prisoner was a disgraced minister like Nicolas Fouquet, who knew too much about the king's early financial maneuverings, or someone possessing a secret that could undermine the king's divine right, the mask ensured that the Bourbon narrative remained unchallenged, monolithic, and pure. In the cold logic of the Sun King, the state was an extension of his own physical body, and any infection, be it a rebellious thought or a dangerous truth, had to be cauterized. This obsession with secrecy extended far beyond the prison walls and into the Cabinet Noir, a sophisticated postal intelligence service. Within the hidden rooms of the Louvre and later Versailles, expert cryptographers and linguists intercepted, copied, and decoded thousands of private letters. Nothing was private. Every whisper in a letter from a duke to his mistress was recorded in a royal ledger. By controlling the flow of information and silencing those who possessed excess knowledge, the Bourbons ensured that the high-pressure pump of power remained insulated from the friction of dissent. The man in the iron mask remains the silent, haunting witness to this era of total control. He represents the dark side of the Enlightenment's early stirrings, and a reminder that the gold of Versailles was only one side of the Bourbon coin. The other side was the cold, silent iron of a prison cell, a place where a man was kept alive for decades, not for his own sake, but as a living vault for a secret that could never be told. Beyond the iron masks and prison walls, Louis XIV established a more pervasive form of control, the Cabinet Noir, the Black Chamber. This was the 17th century version of an intelligence agency, a secret department within the postal service dedicated to the systematic interception of private correspondence. Experts in cryptanalysis and forgery worked in the shadows of the Louvre, using steam to open sealed letters, copying their contents into royal ledgers, and resealing them with forged wax stamps. By controlling the flow of information, the Sun King achieved an informational monopoly that complemented his financial one. He knew the debts of his dukes, and the infidelities of his ministers, and the secret grievances of the merchants. In the Bourbon universe, state secrets were the lubricant that kept the pump running. Knowledge was the ultimate asset, and privacy was a crime against the crown. As we see the king's power reach its zenith, we must recognize that this absolute security was bought at the cost of absolute human erasure. The monopoly was not just over wealth and land, but over the very truth of a man's identity. By the final decades of the 17th century, the Bourbon high-pressure pump was vibrating with a dangerous intensity. Louis XIV had reached the absolute zenith of his power, but the cost of maintaining the golden cage of Versailles, combined with an insatiable expansionist foreign policy, began to fracture the very financial foundations of the state. In this twilight era, the law, once a tool for orderly growth, mutated into a desperate vacuum cleaner that targeted not just the poor, but the very administrative elite the king had spent a lifetime cultivating. The primary driver of this financial desperation was the escalation of global conflict. The 9 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession were not merely military engagements, they were economic black holes. To fund these wars, which spanned from the Rhine to the Caribbean, the crown's traditional revenue streams, nor the gabelle and the tile, were no longer sufficient. In 1695, Louis XIV was forced to break the ultimate social contract of the Ancien Régime by introducing the capitation. This was a direct poll tax that, for the first time in history, officially included the nobility and the clergy. It was a seismic shift in the Bourbon-engineered monopoly. By taxing the privileged, the king admitted that the golden cage was no longer a symbol of abundance, but a liability that required his own courtiers to pay for its upkeep. Inside Versailles, the atmosphere shifted from one of opulent display to one of suffocating, ritualized competition for survival. The Hall of Mirrors, once a celebration of French glassmaking and royal grandeur, became a high-stakes auction house. As the king's treasury bled dry, the value of royal favor plummeted while its price rose. Nobles who had already mortgaged their provincial estates to fund their courtly lives were now forced to plead for exemptions or gratuities that the king could no longer reliably provide. The rituals of the lever and coucher, the waking and bedding of the king, became frantic maneuvers of financial lobbying. To hold the king's candle was no longer a sign of honor. It was a desperate bid for a tax reprieve. The most visceral symbol of this collapse occurred in 1709, the Great Winter. As famine gripped France and the army starved on the frontiers, Louis XIV performed a ritual of self-cannibalization. He ordered the melting down of the legendary silver furniture of Versailles, thrones, tables, and candelabras that were the physical embodiment of his sun-king persona. This was the moment the engineered monopoly consumed itself. When a king is forced to melt his own throne to pay for his survival, the illusion of limitless wealth is shattered. The theater of power was now performing to an audience of skeletal peasants and cynical, bankrupted aristocrats. Ideologically, the monopoly suffered an equally devastating blow with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Seeking a monopoly of the soul to mirror his monopoly on the purse, Louis XIV outlawed Protestantism, triggering a catastrophic brain drain. Over 200,000 Huguenots, the merchants, watchmakers, and bankers who provided the intellectual and financial oil for the Bourbon pump, fled to England, Prussia, and the Netherlands. The king's desire for absolute religious uniformity inadvertently exported France's most productive human capital to its fiercest rivals. As Louis XIV lay dying in 1715, his legacy was a masterpiece of centralization but a ruin of sustainability. He had successfully ensured that only the king held the purse strings, but those strings were now tied to an empty purse and a mountain of debt. The Sun King had transformed the nobility from warriors into decorative ornaments, but in doing so, he had left the monarchy without a buffer against the growing rage of the masses. The gold-dusted thread that Henry IV had spun from Medici gold was now a frayed rope, holding back a tide of resentment that would, decades later, culminate in the very machine designed to end the Bourbon line. The startup was over. The monopoly was established. But the reckoning had only just begun. The dawn of the 18th century brought the greatest opportunity for wealth consolidation in the history of the Bourbon Dynasty. In 1700, the last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, a man so physically and mentally frail from generations of inbreeding that he was known as the Bewitched, died without an heir. His death was the starting gun for a global race. He left behind a power vacuum that encompassed not just the Iberian Peninsula, but a global empire stretching from the silver-rich peaks of the Andes to the bustling galleon ports of Manila. Louis XIV, sensing the chance to complete his engineered monopoly, successfully installed his grandson, Philip V, on the Spanish throne. This was more than a diplomatic victory. It was a hostile takeover of a global treasury, an event that would merge the financial destinies of Paris and Madrid for the next century. However, this transition was anything but peaceful. It triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a true world war that nearly bankrupted the French branch of the family while they fought to secure the Spanish one. Philip V arrived in Madrid to find a kingdom that was a hollow shell of its former glory. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent centuries squandering New World gold on endless European religious wars, leaving the domestic economy stagnant and the royal administration a labyrinth of corruption and inefficiency. To Philip V, who had been raised in the rigid clockwork centralism of his grandfather's Versailles, Spain appeared as a chaotic, failing startup that required a ruthless, top-down restructuring. The Bourbon high-pressure pump was immediately redirected to Spanish soil. Philip V and his French advisors, notably the formidable Princess des Ursins, I'd realized that to maintain the throne against the rival Austrian Habsburgs, they needed to centralize the Spanish state with the same vacuum cleaner efficiency seen in France. The first major obstacle was the ancient, decentralized legal structure of the Spanish regions. Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia held traditional rights, fueros, that allowed them to limit royal taxation and maintain their own administrative customs. Philip V saw these rights not as traditions, but as leaks in his revenue system. Through the Nueva Planta decrees issued between 1707 and 1716, Philip V performed a legal lobotomy on his own kingdom. He abolished these ancient rights, dismantling the regional parliaments and centralizing all administrative, judicial, and financial power in Madrid. For the first time, Spain was being managed as a single, monolithic business unit under the Bourbon brand. This was the birth of the modern Spanish state, built on the ruins of feudal autonomy to ensure that every centavo of tax revenue could be tracked by the central treasury. But the most critical and dark component of Philip V's restructuring was the weaponization of faith. He inherited the Holy Office of the Spanish Inquisition, an institution that had historically functioned as a tool for religious orthodoxy. Under the Bourbons, however, the Inquisition was repurposed into a sophisticated mechanism for political and financial surveillance. Philip V was a man of deep, almost pathological, religious anxieties, often spending hours in confession, but he was also a king who understood that fear was a liquid asset. He used the Inquisition to hunt down Jansenist sympathizers, freethinkers, and, most importantly, anyone suspected of harboring secret loyalties to the old Habsburg regime. This was the era of gold for God and fear for the king. The Inquisition provided a convenient legal framework to bypass traditional courts and seize the estates of rebellious nobles or wealthy conversos, converts from Judaism or Islam. The royal treasury, drained by the War of Succession, was replenished through these systematic seizures. The high-pressure pump was no longer just sucking taxes from the peasantry. It was sucking the capital from the dissenters. The Inquisition's network of informants became the eyes and ears of a new, centralized Bourbon state, ensuring that the engineered monopoly was protected by an aura of holy terror. To fund this expanded, centralized operation, Philip V looked toward the distant Indies. He realized that the Spanish colonies in the Americas, the primary source of the world's silver, were being bled dry by rampant smuggling and the benign neglect of the previous Habsburg administrators. He began the process of Bourbonizing the colonial administration. He introduced the system of intendants, modeled directly after the French bureaucrats who had successfully consolidated power for Louis XIV. These intendants were the district managers of the Bourbon Global Corporation, sent to the New World to oversee the silver mines of Potosí in Mexico with a mandate for total extraction. The bookkeeping trail of this era, though often obscured by religious euphemisms, was undeniably real. Between 1722 and 1726 alone, warehouse manifests from Veracruz, preserved in the Gaceta de Mexico, list millions of silver pesos earmarked for secret charges, a chilling euphemism for the expansion of the inquisitorial and administrative machinery. Philip V's reign was marked by profound personal darkness. He suffered from bouts of debilitating depression where he would refuse to change his linen for months, or believe he was a frog. Yet, and even in the king's madness, the machinery of the state continued to grind with a cold, mechanical precision. His administration had successfully transitioned Spain from a crumbling feudal empire into a rationalized, centralized machine for wealth extraction. The gold-dusted thread spun at Versailles was now reinforced with Spanish silver and tied to the dark, silent iron of the Inquisition's shackles. The global monopoly was no longer a dream. It was a multi-continental reality. As the silver convoys from the New World reached record highs by 1725, the Bourbons had effectively secured the capital needed to maintain their dominance for another century. They had proved that when a dynasty is alchemist enough, even the most devout faith can be transmuted into a tool for absolute financial control. If Philip V's first decade was about seizing the Spanish throne and centralizing its laws through the Nueva Planta decrees, his second act was about attaching the Bourbon high-pressure pump to the most productive silver veins in human history. To understand the scale of this engineered monopoly, one must look beyond the palaces of Madrid to the freezing thin air of the high Andes, specifically to the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosí. For the Bourbons, Potosí was not just a mine. It was the biological heart of their global financial system. The silver extracted here didn't just fund the Spanish crown. It lubricated the entire world economy, from the tea houses of London to the silk markets of Beijing. By controlling the pump at the source, the Bourbons effectively held the world's liquidity hostage. By 1720, the Spanish Bourbon administration, guided by French financial principles, they realized that the old Habsburg methods of extraction were leaking capital like a sieve. Smuggling by the British, Dutch, and French merchants was siphoning off up to 40% of the silver before it ever reached Spanish ports. To stop these leaks, the Bourbons transformed the colonial administration into a high-efficiency corporate bureaucracy. They revitalized and expanded the métier, the ancient system of forced indigenous labor, turning it into a staggering industrial-scale operation. Thousands of Andean workers were treated as disposable human capital, driven into the dark, toxic, and mercury-laden shafts of the Cerro Rico to satisfy the Bourbons' insatiable thirst for silver. This was the vacuum cleaner at its most lethal. Converting indigenous lives directly into the silver bars required to gild the cathedrals of Madrid and pay the mercenaries of the Rhine. The logistical brilliance of this Bourbon monopoly lay in its control of the Spanish dollar, Real de Ocho. These silver coins were the Bitcoin of the 18th century, the only global currency accepted from the Americas to the Philippines and deep into the Chinese interior. By maintaining a total monopoly on the production, minting, and distribution of this silver, the Bourbons functioned as the world's primary central bankers. They perfected the fleet system, ensuring that every ounce of silver followed a strictly controlled royal route. When the silver convoys from Veracruz or Portobello were delayed by weather or war, interest rates in London rose and stock markets in Amsterdam trembled. The Bourbon family was no longer just a royal house. They were the masters of the global money supply, using silver as a financial leash to restrain their rivals. The engineered monopoly also extended to the very technology of silver production. Silver refining in the 18th century required massive quantities of mercury for the patio process. The Bourbons held a death grip on the two primary mercury sources in the world, the Almaden mine in Spain and the Huancavelica mine in Peru. By controlling the mercury faucet, they ensured that no private mining enterprise could operate without royal approval. If a miner attempted to bypass the Quinto Real, the king's 20% cut, the crown simply cut off their supply of mercury, effectively shutting down their operations. This was resource security used as a tactical financial weapon. The law was no longer concerned with justice or indigenous rights. It was a set of technical specifications for a global extraction machine designed to keep the Bourbon vaults overflowing. The sheer volume of this extraction was unprecedented. Modern archival research in the Archivo General de Indias reveals that under the Bourbon reforms, silver production in Mexico and Peru tripled compared to the peaks of the Habsburg era. In 1725, royal shipments reached an 11-year high, and creating a surplus that allowed Philip V to rebuild the Spanish Navy from scratch and fund a global intelligence network that rivaled his grandfather's Cabinet Noir. The silver veins of the Andes provided the Bourbons with the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. No matter how many wars they fought or how much they spent at Versailles, the mountain at Potosí continued to bleed the wealth necessary to reset their ledgers. However, the cost of this monopoly was paid in an agonizing toll of human life and ecological ruin. The mercury-soaked soils of the Andean highlands and the millions of deaths caused by the Mita system were externalized costs in the Bourbon accounts. For every silver bar that arrived in the port of Cadiz, there was a trail of suffering that stretched back across the Atlantic. But in the cold, mathematical logic of the Bourbon court, these deaths were merely operational losses. They had successfully transmuted the raw material of a continent into the refined, absolute power of a dynasty. As the silver flow became a torrent, the Bourbons prepared for their final and most disturbing expansion, moving from the extraction of minerals to the systematic, industrial-scale trafficking of human souls. By the middle of the 18th century, the Bourbon high-pressure pump was due for a massive technical upgrade. The reign of Charles III, 1759 to 1788, represents the moment the dynasty transitioned from a feudal monarchy into a modern, corporate state. Charles III is often hailed by history books as an enlightened despot, a reformer who modernized Madrid and brought science to the Spanish court. However, through the lens of our engineered monopoly, Charles III was less of a philosopher king and more of a ruthless CEO. a man who realized that to compete with the rising British Empire, the Spanish Bourbons had to industrialize their extraction of global resources. He didn't just want to collect taxes, he wanted to control every stage of the global supply chain. The core of Charles's strategy was a series of sweeping measures known as the Bourbon Reforms. To the common observer, and these looked like administrative improvements, the establishment of new viceroyalties, the streamlining of tax collection, and the opening of free trade, comercio libre, between Spanish ports. But free trade under the Bourbons was a double-edged sword. While it genuinely modernized the empire by breaking the stifling monopoly of the port of Cadiz and triggering a massive boom in transatlantic commerce, it was also a tool of absolute centralized control. By allowing more ports to trade directly with Spain, Charles III deliberately bypassed the powerful local Creole elites in Mexico City and Lima. He disintermediated the colonial middlemen to ensure that the immense wealth generated by this economic explosion flowed directly into the royal treasury, inadvertently sowing the seeds of colonial resentment. To enforce this new level of extraction, Charles III turned to the most advanced tools of the age: science and bureaucracy. He dispatched scientific expeditions to the Americas, not merely to study botany, but to conduct resource audits. These scientists were the royal family's corporate scouts, tasked with identifying new veins of silver, mapping efficient transit routes for mule trains, and cataloging every plant that could be turned into a profitable export. The maps they produced were not just for geography, they were blueprints for a more precise high-pressure pump. This was enlightened extraction, and the belief that through better data and centralized management, the natural world could be forced to yield double the revenue for the Bourbon crown. One of the most effective and insidious tools in Charles III's arsenal was the royal monopoly system, specifically the estanco del tabaco, the tobacco monopoly. Charles realized that tobacco was becoming a global addiction, a commodity with high demand and low price elasticity. He seized total control of the production and sale of tobacco in the colonies. Farmers were forced to sell their crops to the royal state at fixed, low prices, and the state would then resell it at a massive markup. This was the engineered monopoly at its most refined, turning a plant into a private cash machine. The profits from tobacco alone funded the construction of the grand neoclassical buildings in Madrid, while the Prado Museum and the Royal Palace's fountains were essentially built on the lungs of smokers and the labor of exploited colonial farmers. The statistical results of Charles III's corporate restructuring were staggering. Under his reign, the revenue reaching Madrid from the Americas increased fivefold. The silver mines of Mexico, bolstered by royal subsidies for mercury and gunpowder, reached production levels that outstripped anything seen in human history. By 1780, Mexico alone was producing over two-thirds of the world's silver. The Bourbons were no longer just wealthy. They were the architects of a global financial hegemony. But this influx of capital had a chilling prerequisite. To maintain these industrialized levels of production in the mines and the burgeoning sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the Bourbons needed a massive, constant, and cheap supply of labor. This requirement led to the most disturbing chapter of Charles III's enlightened reign. He realized that the indigenous labor supply, decimated by centuries of overwork and disease, was insufficient for his global goals. To solve this labor shortage, Charles III and his ministers turned to the transatlantic slave trade with a renewed industrial vigor. They didn't just participate in the trade, they engineered it for maximum efficiency. In the next part, we will see how the enlightened King Charles III fundamentally transformed the port of Havana into a revolving door of human trafficking, proving that for the Bourbons, the greater glory of God was always second to the boundless profit of the family vault. This brutal commodification of human life was an inheritance the Bourbons readily exploited to fuel their global ambitions. The chilling metric known as the pieza de Indias, which reduced a healthy enslaved person to a standardized unit of labor, and the Asiento de Negros monopoly contracts had been established long before the Enlightenment. Rather than dismantling this inherited darkness, the early Spanish Bourbons under Philip V weaponized the Asiento as a diplomatic bargaining chip. Later, as the old monopoly system collapsed under Charles III, The Enlightened crown ruthlessly pivoted to deregulating and expanding the transatlantic slave trade. They ensured a massive, constant supply of enslaved labor for Cuba's booming plantations, proving that the rhetoric of the Enlightenment was always secondary to the boundless profit of the family vault. The language of this trade was a masterclass in Bourbon-engineered monopoly. Within the royal ledgers and customs manifests of the late 18th century, enslaved Africans were not recorded as individuals, but as piezas de Indias, pieces of the Indies. This was a cold, outer mathematical unit of measurement, where a piezza represented a healthy adult male of a certain height and physical condition. Women, children, and the elderly were assessed as fractions of a piezza. By reducing human beings to standardized units of labor, the Bourbons turned the slave trade into an accounting exercise. This precise, chilling language fundamentally transformed the port of Havana into an unrestrained revolving door of human trafficking. The regulatory facades of the past dissolved, replaced by an urgent royal imperative for sheer volume. The statistical evidence of this enlightened expansion is staggering and provides a visceral proof of the Bourbons' ruthlessness. Between 1715 and 1760, a 45-year span, approximately 60,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to Spanish America. However, under Charles III, the pump was set to maximum pressure. In the much shorter 28-year period from 1760 Dorsers, the year Charles ascended the throne, until his death in 1788, that figure shockingly escalated to over 140,000 souls. This was an exponential surge, a deliberate acceleration of forced migration designed to sustain the industrialized production levels of the Bourbon Global Corporation. Havana mutated from a regulated entrepot into a high-capacity warehouse for human capital, where the only metric that mattered was the royal fifth and the profit of the family vault. And the engineered monopoly of the slave trade was the ultimate expression of the Bourbons' ability to turn the law into a vacuum cleaner. The king didn't just authorize the trade. He taxed every pizza that crossed the threshold of the empire. The profits from this trafficking were so vast that they became indistinguishable from the silver of Potosí in the royal treasury. This was the dark alchemy of the Bourbons. They had learned to transmute the suffering of millions into the grand fountains of Madrid and the polished mirrors of their palaces. The sugar that sweetened the Sun King's coffee and the tobacco that filled the royal pipes were fertilized with the blood of an entire continent, managed with the same cold, mechanical efficiency as a silver mine or a silk mill. As the reign of Charles III came to an end, and the Bourbon global monopoly appeared unshakable. They controlled the world's silver, its most addictive commodities, and the very labor supply that produced them. But the high-pressure pump was operating at a level of intensity that the human spirit could not long endure. The cries from the holds of the Spanish brigantines and the whispered rage in the sugar fields of Cuba were beginning to echo back to the streets of Paris. The gold-dusted thread was now a heavy, blood-soaked chain, and in the very wealth that made the Bourbons the masters of the world was about to ignite the fires of a revolution that no amount of colonial silver could extinguish. The reckoning was no longer a distant rumble. It was standing at the palace gates. By the late 1780s, the Bourbon-engineered monopoly in France was no longer a functioning machine of extraction. It had mutated into a catastrophic engine of debt. The high-pressure pump that Louis XIV had perfected through the centralization of Versailles was now vibrating with the structural fatigue of a century of excess. Decades of participation in global conflicts, most notably the ruinous financial support of the American Revolution, had drained the private family vault to a degree that even the silver convoys from the Andes could no longer offset. In the streets of Paris, the air was thick with the scent of a simmering, hungry revolt, fueled by consecutive harvest failures and a royal treasury that was effectively insolvent. At the epicenter of this systemic failure stood Marie Antoinette, a queen who had become the ultimate visual scapegoat for a dynasty that was beginning to consume its own legitimacy. Marie Antoinette's role in the Bourbon narrative is often unfairly reduced to frivolous extravagance, but through the lens of our financial saga, she represents the fatal breakdown of the dynasty's image management. The Bourbons had always relied on the theater of power to intimidate and control the nobility. However, Marie Antoinette committed the ultimate corporate sin. She became bored with the golden cage. By retreating to the Petit Trianon and her private circle, she broke the visual monopoly of the throne. If the queen was not visible, if she was not part of the daily, grinding ritual of Versailles, the aura of absolute grace began to dissolve into a vacuum of suspicion. The public, who had been bled dry by the gabelle and the taille, no longer saw a semi-divine figure. They branded the queen as Madame Deficit, a powerful propaganda tool that redirected the public's rage from the state's systemic military debts toward a single, invisible figure of extravagance. Within this vacuum of royal authority, a dangerous secret bloomed: the forbidden romance between Marie Antoinette and the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen. This was not merely a personal affair of the heart. It was a profound political and security liability. Fersen was a soldier and a diplomat who possessed a key to the Queen's political conscience. Their bond was maintained through a desperate, high-stakes ballet of forbidden passion, as illicit letters written in intricate ciphers and sympathetic ink. Recent scientific analysis using X-ray fluorescence has unmasked the redacted portions of these letters, revealing phrases of mad adoration that the Bourbon state tried for centuries to censor. In a regime built on the absolute sanctity and purity of the royal bloodline, the fact that the Queen's heart, and potentially her loyalty, belonged to a foreign knight represented a leak in the pump that no amount of royal decree could plug. The diamond necklace affair of 1785, though the Queen was technically a victim of fraud, provided the final revolutionary gunpowder. It convinced the French people that the engineered monopoly was now working in reverse, using the last of the nation's credit to fund the illicit jewelry habits of an Austrian interloper. The law, which had once been a vacuum cleaner for the king's benefit, was now being used by the people to demand a public accounting of the king's debts. The gold-dusted thread was now a tightening noose around the neck of the monarchy. The climax of this domestic collapse was the flight to Varennes in June 1791. It was Fersen, the Queen's secret knight, who masterminded this clandestine logistics operation. He personally drove the first stage of the escape, disguised as a common coachman, and a chilling inversion of the Bourbon style, where the elite were now forced to hide their faces to survive. The plan involved double encoded routes, false passports for a Baroness von Korff, and a distinctive heavy yellow coach that moved with a fatal slowness. Ultimately, the Bourbon luck evaporated at a small post house in Varennes. Louis XVI was not recognized by a spy or a soldier, but by a commoner who compared the king's divine aura, failed him when a commoner recognized his profile from the ubiquitous image stamped on the state's currency, proving the king had become a common commodity. The engineered monopoly had failed because the king's image, once a tool of divine intimidation, had become a common commodity, a profile on a depreciating currency that the people now held in their hands with contempt. The arrest at Varennes was the final mechanical failure of the Bourbon pump. The royal family was dragged back to Paris, not as masters, but as prisoners of a nation that had decoded the secret of their power and found it wanting. The wealth of the Americas and the secrets of the Bastille were powerless against the logic of the guillotine. The reckoning was no longer a distant rumble. It was the sharp, metallic sound of the blade falling on 300 years of absolute rule. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 and Marie Antoinette months later marked the first time the Bourbon high-pressure pump was not just broken, but physically decapitated. For the remaining Bourbons, the decade that followed was a surreal transition from being the world's most powerful engineered monopoly to becoming a ghost corporation in exile. While the French Revolution tore down the mirrors of Versailles, the survivors, led by the future Louis XVIII, had to find a way to maintain the gold-dusted thread without a kingdom. They moved across Europe, from Russia to England, carrying with them not just their titles, but the secret blueprints of their administrative power and a deep, burning resentment against the new order. However, the Bourbons soon faced their greatest competitive threat, Napoleon Bonaparte. If the Bourbons were an engineered monopoly based on divine right and silver, Napoleon was a hostile takeover based on merit and gunpowder. Napoleon didn't just replace the king, he upgraded the pump. He took the Bourbon's centralized bureaucracy and electrified it with the Napoleonic Code and a meritocratic military machine. To the Bourbons watching from the shadows of Hartwell House in England, Napoleon was more than a usurper. He was a thief of state technology. He was using their own tools of centralization, their own census methods, and their own tax-gathering structures to build a new world order that had no place for the ancient lilies of France. During these grueling years of exile, the Bourbon strategy shifted from active extraction to financial fossilization. Unable to collect taxes from the French peasantry or silver from the Andes, they relied on the vast, hidden networks of credit and dynastic loyalty they had built over 3 centuries. They became masters of the shadow economy, as operating a government in exile that functioned like a clandestine intelligence agency. They survived on secret subsidies from the British government, who saw the Bourbons as a necessary, albeit expensive, insurance policy against Napoleon's continental dominance. This British gold allowed the Bourbons to fund a web of spies, royalist insurgents, and underground printers inside France, attempting to sabotage the Napoleonic pump from within. This period was also marked by a profound psychological transformation within the family. The golden cage of Versailles was gone, replaced by the damp, drafty halls of English country houses and Russian palaces. Louis XVIII, a man of immense intellect, spent his days refining the Bourbon narrative. He realized that if they ever returned, they couldn't simply restart the old machine of 1788. They had to convince a skeptical Europe that the Bourbon monopoly was the only legitimate guarantee of stability. He began to draft the Chart, a constitution that would, in theory, limit royal power, but in practice was designed to preserve the sacred essence of the dynasty under a new, modern brand. It was a masterpiece of political rebranding, transforming an absolute monarchy into a stabilizing force. The secret heart of the exile, however, remained the memory of the fallen. Count Axel von Fersen, the Queen's secret knight, became a haunting figure in the Bourbon shadow cabinet. He spent his remaining years and his vast Swedish fortune trying to avenge Marie Antoinette, funding anti-revolutionary propaganda, and becoming an architect of the reactionary ultra movement. His obsession mirrored the dynasty's own, a refusal to accept that the world had moved on from the era of divine monopolies. The gold-dusted thread was no longer a vibrant lifeline of wealth. It was being preserved in the amber of resentment, waiting for the moment the Napoleonic sun would set. As Napoleon's empire began to crack under the weight of the Russian winter and the fires of Waterloo, the Bourbons prepared for their restoration. But they were returning to a France that had been fundamentally altered. The engineered monopoly was about to meet a new generation of citizens who had tasted liberty and an economy that was no longer built solely on silver and grain, but on the rising steam of the Industrial Revolution. The Bourbons were coming home with the keys to a palace that the people had already learned to burn, and a pump that was now competing with the engines of a new century. The year 1814 witnessed a phenomenon that many in Europe, still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, thought impossible: the return of the lilies. With Napoleon exiled to Elba, Louis XVIII glided into Paris in a royal carriage that was, in every sense, a psychological time machine. He was attempting to reinstall the Bourbon high-pressure pump into a nation that had been structurally, legally, and emotionally rebuilt by the Revolution and the First Empire. This was the era of the Restoration, but for the Bourbons, it was less about restoring the glory of France and more about reclaiming a lost private monopoly. However, they faced a devastating mechanical problem. The vacuum cleaner of the royal law now had to operate under the prying eyes of a parliament and a constitutional framework known as the Chart. The absolute, unquestioned power of Louis XIV had been replaced by a fragile, negotiated authority that left the king's hands partially tied. The core tension of this period lay in the deepening rift between the king of the charter, the pragmatically minded Louis XVIII, and the ultras, a faction of hardline aristocrats and royalist zealots led by the king's own brother, the future Charles X. These ultras were the ghosts of the old machine. They didn't just want their titles back, they wanted their vanished wealth, their confiscated lands, and their engineered monopoly on French social and economic life. They viewed the revolution not as an inevitable political shift, but as a grand, illegal theft of Bourbon family assets. As the 1820s progressed, especially following the shock of the assassination of the Duke of Berry, the ultras seized control of the political valves of the state, turning France's fiscal policy into a naked weapon of dynastic revenge. And the most audacious and chilling financial maneuver of this era was the law of the billion-franc emigrants, le milliard des émigrés, enacted in 1825 after Charles X took the throne. This was the Bourbon high-pressure pump at its most cynical and desperate. Charles X realized he could not physically seize the lands that had been legally sold to the peasantry and the bourgeoisie during the Revolution without triggering a catastrophic civil war. Instead, he turned the law into a sophisticated vacuum cleaner to extract a staggering 1 billion francs from the national credit to compensate the old nobility for their lost estates. This was essentially a massive state-funded bailout for a bankrupt aristocracy, paid for by the very taxpayers whose fathers had fought to overthrow the feudal system. To fund this unprecedented payout, the Bourbons engaged in a complex and predatory piece of financial alchemy. They forcibly reduced the interest rate on government bonds, the rents, from 5% to 3%. This move was a direct strike against the new money of France. It effectively robbed the middle-class bondholders and the rising merchant class to provide a liquid windfall for the old blood of the aristocracy. It was a hostile transfer of wealth designed to restore the financial hegemony of Bourbon loyalists at the expense of national stability. The gold-dusted thread was now being respun directly out of the pockets of the bourgeoisie, creating a deep, toxic, and audible resentment that began to vibrate through the streets of Paris and the burgeoning industrial centers. Simultaneously, Charles X attempted to re-establish a monopoly of the soul to mirror his financial ambitions. A man who believed so fervently in his divine right that he revived the ancient mystical ceremony of touching for the king's evil, scrofula. Shortly after his coronation, Charles sought to return the Catholic Church to its role as the dynasty's ideological police force. He pushed through the sacrilege law, which made the desecration of church vessels or the theft of a host a capital offense punishable by death, and a chilling echo of the methods used by the Spanish Inquisition in the other branch of the family. The pump was no longer just about silver and land. It was about reimposing a rigid spiritual and financial hierarchy that the Enlightenment and the Revolution had supposedly shattered. However, the world had moved far beyond the mechanical logic of the 17th century. The Industrial Revolution was creating new, decentralized centers of wealth and influence that the king's vacuum cleaner could not adequately reach. The rise of independent newspapers, the efficiency of steam engines, and the growing collective power of the working class were leaks in the Bourbon system that no royal decree could plug. Charles X, stubborn, aging, and entirely disconnected from the realities of 1830, refused to acknowledge these shifts. He believed that if the pump wasn't producing the desired results, the solution was simply to increase the pressure regardless of the structural integrity of the machine. This arrogance led to the July Ordinances, a final, desperate attempt to silence the press, dissolve the legislature, and disenfranchise the middle class. But this time, when the Bourbons tried to turn the vacuum cleaner on, they found that the people of Paris had already cut the power. The billion-franc heist had been the final betrayal, and proving that the Bourbons had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. The reckoning was no longer a ghost. It was a physical barricade blocking the path of the dynasty once and for all. The final collapse of the Bourbon high-pressure pump in France did not happen with a slow leak, but with a violent explosion in July 1830. Charles X, the aging architect of the billion-franc heist, had spent 5 years trying to rewind the clock of history. By 1830, his administration had reached a state of total disconnect from the reality of a post-Napoleonic, industrializing nation. He believed that the divine right of the Bourbons was an immutable law of nature, and that the French people were merely subjects to be managed, not citizens to be heard. This arrogance culminated in the July Ordinances, a series of decrees intended to dissolve the newly elected Chamber of Deputies, further restrict the already limited franchise, and effectively abolish the freedom of the press. It was the king's final attempt to turn the vacuum cleaner of the law back into an absolute weapon. But the streets of Paris had changed. The 3 glorious days, les trois glorieuses, of July 27th, 28th, and 29th, 1830, saw the emergence of a new kind of power that the Bourbon machinery could not process. Barricades, built from the very cobblestones of the city, blocked the royal troops. The gold-dusted thread was finally snapped not by a foreign army, but by a coalition of liberal journalists, middle-class merchants, and working-class radicals who had been pushed to the brink by the financial excesses of the Restoration. Charles X, stunned that his subjects would refuse his divine commands, was forced to abdicate. He fled into exile, carrying with him the last remnants of the crown jewels, marking the permanent end of the senior Bourbon line on the French throne. However, the engineered monopoly did not simply vanish. It evolved into a new, fossilized form. While the Bourbons lost the political pump of the state, they retained the vast, private wealth they had siphoned into their family vaults over centuries. The vacuum cleaner had worked so well for 300 years that the family's private assets were now detached from the fate of the throne itself. In the decades following 1830, the Bourbons transitioned from being the masters of a state to being the world's most elite landlords and museum curators. They converted their remaining palaces and estates into trusts and foundations, ensuring that while the Lilies no longer ruled, the Bourbon name remained synonymous with unimaginable, inherited wealth. This transition represents the birth of the modern Bourbon legacy. They learned to hide their wealth in the bouquet of legal trusts and non-profit foundations. Their properties like the Château de Chambord or the vast estates in Spain were reorganized into historical monuments, allowing the family to preserve their heritage while shielding it from the rising taxes of the new democratic republics. They moved from the high-pressure pump to the long-term trust, proving that if you extract enough wealth over enough centuries, you can survive even the death of your own political system. Today, the legacy of the Bourbon monopoly survives in two distinct forms. In Spain, the branch established by Philip V still holds the throne under King Felipe VI, a testament to the family's incredible ability to adapt and survive through civil wars, republics, and dictatorships. In France, the Bourbon name lives on in the quiet, immense power of old money and the meticulously preserved halls of Versailles, which now serves as a global tourist machine, extracting revenue from millions of visitors in a way Louis XIV could never have imagined. The story of the Bourbons is the ultimate saga of how wealth and power can be engineered into a self-sustaining monopoly. From the Medici gold that funded Henry IV's startup, through the silver veins of Potosí and the blood-stained ledgers of the slave trade, to the billion-franc heist of the Restoration, the Bourbons turned the world into a private family venture. They proved that a crown can be taken, a king can be executed, and a throne can be burned, but an engineered monopoly, once it has siphoned enough of the world's marrow, becomes a ghost in the machine of history, a silent force that continues to shape the global economy long after the mirrors of Versailles have dimmed. The year 1830 marked the end of the Bourbons' direct political high-pressure pump in France, but it was far from the end of the family's engineered monopoly. If the previous 4 centuries were about the aggressive, often bloody, extraction of global wealth, the modern era became a masterclass in the alchemy of preservation. The Bourbons realized a fundamental truth of the new industrial and democratic age. In a world of rising republics, constitutional oversight, and the looming shadow of the guillotine, a visible throne is a dangerous liability, but an invisible trust is an invincible fortress. This first phase of their modern evolution saw the family transition from being the absolute masters of a state to being the world's most sophisticated, fossilized, wealthy elite. They successfully turned their siphoned billions into a self-sustaining financial ecosystem that operated far above the reach of national laws. The core of this transformation was the systematic fossilization of royal assets. As the political map of Europe was redrawn by revolutions and world wars, the Bourbons began to shift their wealth out of the reach of potentially hostile governments. They didn't just hide gold, they restructured the very nature of their ownership. Using the early burgeoning frameworks of international private law and maritime jurisdictions, they moved vast tracts of land, priceless art collections, and the surviving remnants of the colonial silver reserves into private family foundations and complex trusts. These entities were designed to be boon keys, legal bunkers that shielded the family's core capital from the inheritance taxes, public audits, and seizure decrees of the emerging democratic republics. The gold-dusted thread was no longer tied to a king's heel, but to the anonymous ledgers of private Swiss bankers and elite London law firms. This was the birth of the long-term trust model of power. While the French branch lived in a state of carefully managed aristocratic seclusion, the Spanish branch, having survived their own tumultuous cycles of exile, civil war, and restoration, perfected the art of the institutional shield. In Spain, the Bourbons maintained a unique, symbiotic relationship with the state, where the royal patrimony, Patrimonio Nacional, functioned as a blurred and convenient line between public heritage and private privilege. By designating their historic palaces, such as the Royal Palace of Madrid or the Escorial, as national monuments and public museums, they essentially forced the Spanish taxpayers to fund the astronomical maintenance of their ancestral golden cages. Meanwhile, they retained the immense social and symbolic capital of residing within or controlling these spaces. This was the vacuum cleaner in its most evolved, subtle form, extracting the massive costs of historical preservation from the public purse while keeping the prestige and privacy for the family vault. Inside these legal structures, the Bourbons also pioneered the concept of art as frozen capital. The family had spent centuries using the high-pressure pump to accumulate the finest works of European art: Velázquez, Goya, Titian, and Rubens. In the modern era, they realized that these masterpieces were more than just symbols of royal grace. They were a form of universal currency that never depreciated and was difficult for governments to track or tax. By establishing or exerting deep influence over great national galleries like the Prado Museum, they housed their wealth in a way that was politically untouchable and socially revered. An oil painting on a museum wall is presented as a public treasure, but it also serves as a permanent, immovable anchor for the family's historical legitimacy and global status. They effectively converted their raw, brutal extraction from the mines of Potosí and the transatlantic slave trade into the cultural capital that defines the Western artistic canon today. The statistical and logistical reality of this modern fossilization is staggering, though it remains intentionally obscured by layers of corporate secrecy, shell companies, and non-profit facades. It is estimated that the various branches of the Bourbon family, through their interconnected trusts, offshore accounts, and immense real estate holdings, remain one of the wealthiest and most influential dynastic networks in Europe. Their engineered monopoly has successfully survived the transition from the era of silver-laden galleons and absolute decrees to the era of global hedge funds and digital assets. They proved that if you extract enough marrow over enough centuries, you can create a financial ghost that continues to haunt and influence the global economy long after the physical throne has been burned to ash. The startup of Henry IV had evolved into a permanent, invisible infrastructure of power, proving that the most effective way to rule a modern, transparent world is to ensure that everyone sees the magnificent museum, but absolutely no one can see the vault hidden beneath it. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Bourbon Dynasty completed a spectacular metamorphosis, transitioning from reigning monarchs who ruled by divine decree to elite property owners who rule through the sophisticated application of civil law and corporate structures. The high-pressure pump that once extracted physical silver from the veins of Potosí was meticulously recalibrated to capture the surplus value of Europe's most iconic real estate. In this era of democratic revolutions and wealth taxes, the Bourbon strategy shifted toward fossilizing their assets into complex legal entities, where the line between private privilege and national heritage was intentionally blurred to safeguard the family's core capital. The centerpiece of this modern survival strategy is the utilization of heritage foundations, Fundaciones de Patrimonio. Realizing that direct personal ownership of vast estates and palaces made them easy targets for inheritance taxes or revolutionary seizure, the Bourbons began transferring their ancestral seats into non-profit organizations or state-managed trusts. In Spain, this reached its zenith through the establishment of the Patrimonio Nacional. This unique legal arrangement created an institutional shield for the dynasty. Palaces such as the Palacio de la Zarzuela or the massive hunting estates in Doñana are technically owned by the state, but are reserved for the exclusive use of the Bourbon family. This effectively turned the Spanish taxpayer into the involuntary benefactor of the dynasty's lifestyle. The state pays for the astronomical costs of security, architectural maintenance, and staffing, while the Bourbons retain the immense social and symbolic capital of residing within these golden cages. It is the vacuum cleaner in its most evolved, subtle form, socializing the costs of preservation while privatizing the prestige. Outside of the Spanish throne, the exiled branches of the family, most notably the House of Orléans in France, pioneered similar techniques of fossilization. They moved their remaining historic assets, such as the Château d'Amboise, into private entities like the Fondation St. Louis. By doing so, they shielded these billion-dollar properties from being broken up through inheritance laws. Under the guise of cultural preservation for humanity, these estates receive significant tax exemptions and government subsidies. The Bourbons demonstrated a superior financial acumen. They understood that in the 20th century, the best way to keep a palace was to declare it a national monument. And by allowing the public to visit the gardens, they ensured that the state would protect the walls, while the family maintained the underlying power and historical legitimacy associated with the site. However, the modern Bourbon monopoly extends far beyond stone walls. It has mastered the corporate veil. Following the massive disruptions of the world wars and the rise of global financial markets, the family diversified their wealth into the shadow economy. Through a labyrinthine network of shell companies and offshore accounts in jurisdictions such as Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, the Bourbons transitioned from being visible landowners to being invisible shareholders. The wealth that once arrived in galleons is now managed by discreet wealth management firms in London and New York. This fossilized capital is invested in high-yield diversified portfolios, ranging from energy and infrastructure to luxury goods and tech. Unlike the era of Louis XIV, where every expenditure was flaunted to intimidate rivals, modern Bourbon wealth operates in total silence. The gold-dusted thread is now woven into the digital ledgers of global finance, ensuring that even as governments rise and fall, the core family vault remains insulated from political friction. The rise of mass global tourism in the latter half of the 20th century inadvertently provided the Bourbons with a new, highly efficient pump. The world's fascination with royal history turned Versailles, the royal palace of Madrid, and various Bourbon-linked sites into massive revenue-generating machines. While the family may not always collect the ticket sales directly, the constant reinforcement of the Bourbon brand in global pop culture through film, fashion, and historical documentaries creates an invaluable form of soft power. This cultural monopoly allows the family to maintain an elite network of connections that spans the highest levels of global politics and business. They have successfully converted their history of brutal extraction into a premium luxury brand, where millions of people willingly pay to admire the very monuments that were built on the blood and sweat of their ancestors. Current financial estimates of the various Bourbon branches and their associated trusts suggest that they remain one of the most resilient old money networks in existence. By fossilizing their wealth, they have achieved a form of financial immortality. They proved that while a throne is a temporary political seat, the land and the narrative are permanent assets. The Bourbon monopoly no longer requires the Inquisition or a standing army to protect its interests. It is protected by ironclad legal contracts, non-profit tax status, and the world's collective reverence for heritage. They have shown that if you extract enough of the world's marrow over enough centuries, you can survive the death of your own political system and emerge as the ultimate ghosts in the machine of modern capitalism. The engineered monopoly is no longer about ruling a nation. It is about owning the history that the nation is built upon. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Bourbon engineered monopoly achieved its most profound and invisible transmutation. Having successfully fossilized their physical assets into foundations and trusts, the dynasty turned its attention to the most potent resource of the modern age: collective memory. This period marks the birth of what can be termed the museum-industrial complex, a sophisticated mechanism where the Bourbon's historical narrative was converted into a self-sustaining financial and cultural engine. No longer needing to extract silver from the ground, the family and the institutions that guard their legacy learn to extract revenue from the global fascination with their own former excess. The primary pump of this era is the conversion of the golden cage into a high-throughput commercial enterprise. Versailles, once the private, high-pressure instrument of Louis XIV's domestic control, has been rebranded as the Global Temple of Heritage. Under this modern management, the site functions as a massive vacuum cleaner for tourist capital. Every year, millions of visitors from every corner of the globe pay entrance fees, purchase branded luxury goods, and consume media content that romanticizes the very system of extraction that once fueled the Bourbon throne. The Bourbons effectively transformed their history of brutal centralization and colonial exploitation into a premium luxury brand. By curating an image of Gallic grace and Bourbon magnificence, the family's legacy continues to generate billions in indirect economic value, maintaining their status as the ultimate arbiters of Western taste and high culture. Within this museum-industrial complex, the Bourbons mastered the art of the cultural bailout. By placing their priceless art collections, amassed over centuries via the Quinto Real and the Asiento, into public-private partnerships, they ensured that the state would bear the immense costs of insurance, restoration, and security. In Spain, the Royal Collections Gallery, Galería de las Colecciones Reales, serves as a modern manifestation of this principle. It is a billion-euro vault, funded by the Spanish state, designed to showcase the Bourbons' ancestral treasures. While the public gains access to the art, the Bourbon Dynasty gains something far more valuable: a permanent, state-funded monument to their historical legitimacy. This is the alchemy of presence, ensuring that even in a democratic era, the family's artifacts remain the literal foundation of the national identity. The engineered monopoly also expanded into the digital and media realms. The Bourbons and their institutional guardians realized that in the 21st century, attention is the new silver. Through the licensing of their image, the production of historical docudramas, and collaborations with high-end fashion houses, the Bourbon aesthetic has been tokenized. The dynasty's history is sold back to the public as a commodity of aspiration. When a luxury brand uses the Bourbon style or the Versailles aesthetic, they are paying a symbolic tax to a narrative that the family spent 300 years constructing. This is soft power extraction, a system where the world's elite still look to the Bourbon standard to define what it means to be royal, thereby preserving the family's social monopoly, even without a political scepter. Behind the velvet ropes and the polished glass of the museums, the financial high-pressure pump remains active in the form of sovereign and private wealth networks. The Bourbon family, particularly through its Spanish branch and its various cadet lines in Italy and France, sits at the center of an elite web of European old money. This network functions as a private, informal, central bank for dynastic interests. They utilize their historical prestige to act as diplomatic fixers and high-level arbitrators in global business. A Bourbon signature on a corporate board or a royal presence at a diplomatic gala is a form of symbolic capital that can be converted into tangible investment opportunities, real estate deals, and preferential access to emerging markets. They have moved from ruling the state to influencing the global corridors of power where the state itself is merely a stakeholder. The statistical scale of this museum monopoly is evident in the numbers. The tourist economy surrounding Bourbon heritage in France and Spain alone is estimated to be worth tens of billions of euros annually. By hiding in plain sight within the museum walls, the Bourbons have achieved a level of security that Louis XVI could only have dreamed of. They have outsourced the risk of governance to the people, while retaining the monopoly on the historical capital that the people now pay to worship. The gold-dusted thread has become a digital fiber optic cable, connecting the ancient wealth of the New World silver mines to the modern profits of the global heritage industry. The startup that Henry IV began with Medici Gold has successfully evolved into an immortal, cultural financial infrastructure. A monopoly that no revolution can touch because it has become part of the very air the world breathes. As we reach the present day in 2026, the Bourbon engineered monopoly has completed its most radical migration, from physical stone and silver to the intangible realms of digital sovereignty and global wealth networks. The high-pressure pump has been digitized, refined into algorithms of asset management and encrypted trusts that move faster than any revolutionary mob could ever march. The Bourbons of the 21st century have proven that they are not relics of the past, but the ultimate ghosts in the machine of modern capitalism. They have successfully decoupled the family's survival from the fate of any single nation-state, creating a decentralized, globalized version of the monopoly Henry IV launched 4 centuries ago. In 2026, the Golden Cage is no longer a physical palace like Versailles, but a high-tech, invisible network of family offices and private trusts. Modern Bourbon descendants, whether in the reigning Spanish house or the influential French and Italian branches, utilize the most advanced financial technologies to manage their fossilized capital. They have embraced the era of digital assets, converting portions of their vast real estate and art holdings into tokenized investments. By utilizing blockchain technology for the provenance and fractional ownership of their ancestral collections, the Bourbons ensure that their wealth remains liquid and portable. This is the alchemy of the 21st century, the ability to turn a 17th century Velázquez painting into a 24/7 global financial instrument without it ever leaving the high-security vaults of Switzerland or Luxembourg. The vacuum cleaner of the law has also evolved into the realm of diplomatic and legal immunity. The modern Bourbons sit at the apex of a global shadow diplomacy. King Felipe VI of Spain, for instance, and he operates as a crucial link between Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America, regions where the Bourbon brand still carries immense weight. This is not just protocol, it is an economic asset. The family acts as the ultimate high-level fixers, utilizing their historical prestige to facilitate multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deals and sovereign wealth fund investments. Their soft power is so deeply integrated into the structures of global governance that the dynasty has become a permanent, non-elected stakeholder in the world's financial stability. They have mastered the art of being too historic to fail, ensuring that the modern state continues to protect their interests as a matter of national and cultural security. However, the 2026 monopoly also faces its greatest challenge: the era of radical transparency. In an age of leaks like the Pandora Papers and social media scrutiny, the Bourbons' penchant for secrecy has had to adapt. They have shifted from the cabinet noir of Louis XIV to a sophisticated reputation management machine. They employ elite PR firms and digital ghostwriters to curate their public image, emphasizing their roles as patrons of the environment, champions of democratic stability, and guardians of universal heritage. They have successfully rebranded their ancestral monopoly of the soul into a monopoly of morality. By aligning the Bourbon name with global sustainability goals and high-culture philanthropy, they deflect criticism of their historical extraction, making it socially expensive to question the origin of their wealth. The statistical reality of the Bourbon reach in 2026 remains breathtaking. Through their indirect influence on sovereign wealth funds, their control over historic land trusts, and their hidden stakes in global banking, the dynasty remains one of the most powerful old money networks on the planet. They have successfully survived the transition from the era of absolute kings to the era of absolute data. The gold-dusted thread has become a sophisticated encryption key, protecting a family vault that is now distributed across 1,000 servers and 100 jurisdictions. They proved that if you can own the narrative of history and the infrastructure of wealth, that you never truly need to wear a physical crown again. As we conclude this 4-century saga, the lesson of the Bourbons is clear. A monopoly, once perfectly engineered, never truly dies. It only changes state. From the silver mines of Potosí to the digital ledgers of 2026, the Bourbons have shown that wealth is not just money. It is the ability to turn the law into a vacuum cleaner and history into a fortress. The high-pressure pump is still running, silent and invisible, on beneath the floorboards of the global economy. As visitors walk through the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, they are not just looking at the past, they are standing inside the most successful corporate headquarters in human history. The Bourbon startup did not just survive, it became the very code upon which the modern world is written.